Is NBC News correspondent Von Hilliard, staff writer at The Atlantic, MSNBC political contributor and author of Thank You for Your Servitude, Mark Leibovich, senior national political correspondent, MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker, and former White House communications director under President Obama and former communications director for the Hillary for America campaign, Jennifer Palmieri. She's also the co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast. And she won the Many Titles Awards. Let's start here with you,
Thank you, Katie.
Jen. It's again, unknown territory.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is fundraising off of this. The campaign believes that this will work for him.
Right.
If you are a voter who hasn't been paying attention, how does the Joe Biden team get at that voter? And how do they convince that voter that what happened here in New York was fair?
So I think what the president's remarks were really smart today, because he did not argue that Donald Trump should not be president because he was convicted of a crime. He argued that the trial was fair. That is the fight that the Biden campaign wants to have for the next 6 weeks, right? We have the debate in just a few weeks. We have the sentencing on July 11th. You have the Republican National Convention on July 15th. In those 6 weeks, define this fight as being whether or not that trial was fair. And if you do that, then I think you have a better shot with swing voters of saying that trial was fair. And what Donald Trump is trying to do is upend our judicial system.
Can I interrupt you for just a second? Because I spent quite a bit of time today reading through pages and pages and pages of transcripts. So many of our correspondents were out there interviewing voters, and many of them didn't think it was fair or thought it was fair. But some of them said they thought it was fair, but not serious. And so they didn't think it should have been brought in the first place. So that's another group of possible voters, right?
And then so it's smart because you're not arguing that it was serious. You're just arguing that he is not accepting a really important standard in our democracy, that a jury of his peers and a trial that was conducted fairly and he had all his rights protected in it, that he is not willing to accept the outcome of that. And that is a good argument to have.
But Jen, he also argued that the election wasn't fair, despite 63 court decisions. He has his own reality, his own sets of facts.
Alternative
facts, right? And if this campaign is going, and if the debate is going to be fought on that basis, it's going to be very frustrating and misleading for the American people and undermining to the rule of law and dangerous to jurors, the judges, not just this judge, but all judges, given that people are being tracked according to groups and according to indices that that law enforcement look at. But then there are the lone actors. We've seen what's going to happen.
Yeah, like the Jan 6 Capitol Hill officer, Michael Fanone's mother getting swatted the other day. Yeah.
The judge in New Jersey whose son was killed.
I work in my many titles. I worked for Hillary Clinton. I did not greet yesterday with any sort of glee or happiness because it's so weighty that a former president of the United States has been convicted of a crime and the United States may make him president anyway. I mean, that is very frightening. And so I think that when you are, and not everyone, sure, a lot of his base is going to just rally around him. But I think there's a lot of swing voters, there's a lot of Republicans that are going to be really concerned when they continue. And Trump today, that was unhinged and frightening to watch. And I think that people will react to, fair-minded people will believe that this trial was fair and what he's trying to do.
We can get to today's press conference in a moment, but I do want, Lebo, I want you to weigh in on this. What do you think of what Jen said regarding the swing voters? I know you spent so much time talking to Nikki Haley voters. Which way do you think they fall?
Well, I mean, I agree with Jen on a lot of things. I mean, certainly, I think Biden's remarks today were responsible. I think Trump's remarks today were utterly unsurprising. What struck me about the last 24 hours, and really what I've reacted to, was not whether the jury was a surprise or not, but the continued drumbeat of the Republican Party, one elected official after another. I mean, I think, Trump's whatever the Trump sickness, whatever you want to call it, is set. We've seen it for 8 years. His voters are their own mysteries. What continues to be, to me, the most potent part of the story and the most dangerous and depressing part of the story is those who know better. It's the stream of Republican elected officials, Speaker of the House on down, every would-be vice president. It's very unseemly, and it's a drumbeat. And that's one thing I think that's been missing from the Democratic response today. I think beyond Biden, there, I think, has been a dearth of Democratic surrogates channeling a kind of counter outrage at this, because I think a lot of the outrage from Republicans is manufactured to begin with. I think it's disingenuous. But I also think what they're doing is real damage to the fabric of the country. And I think one of the things about what Biden was saying today is he was speaking as a candidate mainly, but as a country, this is a very, very, I think, precarious moment, which really does need some pretty strong voices in the other direction, which I hope we will hear more from in the next few days.
And Vaughn, you've been covering the Trump campaign nonstop for quite some time now. So what are you hearing? Are voters likely to follow his lead and believe that this trial was completely unfair, that the jury was rigged, the judge was unfair, the prosecution was unfair, and he become a hero, as he becomes more of a victim, as he did with each succeeding indictment?
Right, Andrea. I think Mark's point is a good one. Just how many other prominent Republicans out there go and legitimize the claims that Donald Trump is making about the justice system, that he claims was unfairly prosecuting him, that led to this verdict, despite it being by 12 jurors here in New York, 11 of whom his own defense team did not question or challenge during the jury instructions. And when I say that, I think you can just take somewhere like Pennsylvania as an example. There is another prominent Republican who is going to be on that ballot, and his name is Dave McCormick. He is running for the U.S. Senate seat this very November. And he, just 3 weeks ago, was down at Mar-a-Lago for a fundraiser for Donald Trump, despite in 2022 him being absolutely lampooned in the primary against Mehmet Oz by Donald Trump, who said everything in the book about Dave McCormick. And to a great many folks, ultimately, right, Pennsylvania chose to go for not the Republicans in Pennsylvania in 2022. And by and large, you saw individuals like Dave McCormick largely sit on the sidelines. And so the question is, in some of these battleground states, in places like Arizona, do you see some folks that are still, the likes of a Karen Taylor Robeson, others that were more of the McCain era Republican Party come out and defend him and legitimize these claims that undercut the integrity of the U.S. justice system and have their backs to Donald Trump? Because that is what you saw in 2022 allow for Democrats to win in otherwise what should have been a good year for Republicans when there was anticipated as a red wave. So frankly, ever since 2016, when voters have had the opportunity to reject Trumpism, they have. And the question is, this go around, Donald Trump has not changed his temperature or his approach or the way that, coming out of what we just were inside of Trump Tower, there was 30 minutes there, right? He could have gone through the justice system has spoken, we're going to go through the appeals process, but that's not what he did. He continued to play from the same book that he has for the last 6 years.
What did change on these down ballot races, especially in the Senate, is that this time, having made the mistake and insisted on some of these outlying Republican candidates last time, and this particularly Mitch McConnell and his chief ally chose the candidates, and there was an agreement, an understanding with Donald Trump that the Senate was too important to them, and that's why Dave McCormick is the candidate.
Candidate quality.
Yeah, and I think, obviously the pollsters, and Joe knows this, are very, very busy today, and we're going to start to get a sense over the next several days about how a broader swath of the public is reacting to this, Ashley Parker. But I think at its core, there are lots of people who are arguing now that ultimately maybe the most critical part of polling and reaction is really about how people feel about democracy and the preservation of democracy and support for our criminal justice system, or only, as some would argue, only support democracy and the criminal justice system when you win. And I wonder, as someone who keeps such a close eye and has done so many deep dives, including on polling, what you're going to be watching for in the coming hours and days and weeks.
Well, a couple of things. I was just in Wisconsin last week where I spoke with more than 60 voters just about the election in general. And it was fascinating to me that not one, and these were voters who, like much of America, don't love either choice. And not one of them mentioned the trial when they were talking about their concerns with Donald Trump. So it will be interesting to see how much this is broken through. It seems pretty clear that just about everyone is aware of yesterday's verdict. And if this will be more top of mind as voters are looking ahead to making their decisions. And then going back to a point Jen made early on, another thing I'm curious about is sort of what it says. And there's nothing that prevents as we are witnessing in unprecedented real time, there's nothing that prevents a former president and convicted felon from being elected president again. But I am curious about hearing from those voters who are choosing to vote for him still, and sort of what it says about our nation and our values if he is elected again.